Yeah. Okay. So, welcome back to the Friendly Tech Chats. I'm Mikola, back after a long pause, and I'm today with Joost, who will be talking about his recent blog post. Joost, can
Yeah,
you tell
hi.
us?
Yeah, I could tell you about it. So recently I joined a new team, and in that team, we were suffering a bit from alert fatigue. So we were getting a lot of alerts, and they were not always actionable. They were not always recoverable. Like it was just a lot of noise. So the signal to noise ratio of our alerts was in a bad place. And I set out to try and change that. And one of the alerts that we were getting was for a broken pipe exception, a Java IO exception. And this happens when we're building an application that has a front end. And when the user navigates away, when they navigate away while they're still receiving data from our backend, larger responses, the browser cuts the connection and our backend was throwing this exception. And this is not something we can come back from, right? The user is already gone, left our website. The data they are no longer interested in. And it was just creating noise for us quite a bit. And it caused us to look at the logs every time when it happened. And then, okay, it's a broken pipe again, nothing we can do. And when you have one type of exception where that happens, is maybe not such a big problem. And when you have 3, 4, 5 of those, it starts to create a lot of noise. And we have an operator on duty, one person in the team that is responsible throughout the week to investigate all of these alerts. And you just get very fatigued. You don't want to do that at some point anymore because it's always something you can't action, something you can't fix for the user. And that's a bad place to be in as a team, right? Because when you start thinking that way, there's an alert, but it doesn't matter because nothing is wrong. Things are going to slip through where something is actually wrong, and you're going to be in trouble with your users. So I figured, I want to fix this one. And of course, I wanted to reproduce it locally. Like I wanted to see locally when does this happen. And we had this theory it was when the user would navigate away with the browser. But we didn't substantiate that with any real evidence. So, let's start up the servers locally on my machine and see how can I introduce some state or some interaction where this error actually pops up, where this exception starts to be thrown by the service. And I figured, I need something to play around with the network so that I can influence the traffic going to the service. And I ended up using toxiproxy for that.
Yay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that, okay, one thing is if it's one type of an exception, but there are 3, 4, 5. What do you mean? Is it like different manifestation of the same broken pipe or different types?
No, I actually mean like different. Like this application was a bit for our platform, which is fairly new on the older side. So there was just a bit of maintenance left that wasn't done for a long time with the alerting setup, with the logging setup in the first place, right? We were alerting when there's errors being logged, but we were logging alerts or we were logging errors for things that aren't actually errors, right? So this alert was firing way too often, and it was not just for the broken pipe, but a few different cases were also being thrown, all of them non-actionable.
Yeah. That's a frequent thing to find in applications that hasn't been enough love. Lots of logs, error logs that are either not actionable or can be actionable but not that urgent. And I should say that this broken pipe, it has been haunting me, like I think for forever. I remember being like 20, no, maybe 20 is a little bit too much. I remember being 10 years ago haunted by this exception. So how did you fix it?
Well, yeah, so with toxiproxy, you run a service locally, the toxiproxy service. Yeah, you could proxy the outgoing traffic of your service through that, but you can also use it to sit between your client and your service. And that's what we needed in this case, right? Because we're talking about a user with a browser navigating away from the page while still receiving data. So what I needed to do is have a client tunnel its traffic through toxiproxy to the service so that I can fiddle with how the client is behaving through toxiproxy, because that's what toxiproxy does, right? It stands for toxic proxy, I guess, right? So you can...
I like the name. Yeah. I don't know why I have never used it. I missed it so much all the time. By the name just. Yes.
Yeah. It allows you to introduce network latency, slow connections. That's the same as network latency. But you can mess with how the network behaves, right? So in this case, I set up toxiproxy to take any traffic it was receiving and put it through to the service, and introduce a toxic, the way it's called in toxiproxy, where whenever a byte of data was received, it would cut the connection to the service, right? And then I could just use curl from the command line to call the endpoint that I wanted. And I got lucky on the first one. So I set up the toxiproxy, I did the first call, and immediately the broken pipe was there in the logs of the service. And the client showed also, well, didn't receive any data, something went wrong. So great, I can reproduce. So what we had already a controller advice set up, Spring controller advice. So any exceptions thrown by our REST endpoints would be handled by that class. And it's very easy to just add a method, annotate it with the exception you want to handle. And then whenever that thing gets thrown, your function will fire and you can deal with it how you want. Right? So what we discussed with the team is, instead of logging an error and throwing the exception, what we wanted to do is increase a metric. So we still have some observability on, okay, how often is this happening, right? Because we remember that when we started with this, we still had the theory it was browsers navigating away. We weren't 100% sure. You could imagine that somewhere in the future we introduce some defect where we're throwing more of these broken pipes, or it starts happening often because something we built. And we still wanted to have some visibility on that. So we said, okay, whenever it happens, we increase a metric. We put that metric on our dashboard so we can keep track of it, but in a healthier way than getting alerted for it. The tricky thing there, it's not really tricky, but it's a Java I/O exception with a specific cause, right? So I needed to catch the Java I/O exception in the controller advice, check that the cause is actually broken pipe, then increase the metric and suppress the exception. But if it's something else, I still want to throw it, because then something else is wrong, right? We could have I/O exceptions for different reasons. So that's what we did, and wrote exception handling for that, added the metric, tried another endpoint, and nothing happened. And that's when I called you, actually, like, okay, Mikola.
Don't tell. They will know that it's staged. Yes. I remember we started to look, and first we were trying to see whether there is a difference in how the controller is set up, and because it's an old service and there are layers of history, there was some differences, but when we eliminated, the things seemed to be the same and they were still acting slightly differently. Then I noticed that the first lucky case, it was producing lots of data, whereas the second case, the second API call that we were trying, at least in our test system, it was producing very, very small amount of data. So I thought, well, maybe it's something with the buffering, because everywhere along the chain we have buffers, and if buffer is not full, if buffer is fully filled in or not fully filled in, it can be pushed out differently and can produce exceptions in different ways. So I suggested let's try to increase the response size by adding some garbage into the response, and I think it worked pretty quickly.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. It was really to do with the size of the response. And I was sort of set on the wrong foot, because the client side was giving the exact same error. And I was thinking, like, why doesn't the server side report anything of this? But because the response size was so small, was already done sending all the data, didn't care anymore that the connection was getting closed forcefully by toxiproxy. So once we caught on to that, we figured, okay, that's fine. Things got merged, things got deployed to production, and it's whizzing along nicely. Like one down, a few more to go, but we're really getting in a good place now with the amount of alerts that we're getting, and where there's really something wrong when it fires.
You mentioned a dashboard, right? So we put it on the dashboard. And how big our dashboard? Do we have a place for such things, or individual? Or?
Our setup, we're using Grafana, right, with Prometheus. Most of our dashboards focus on the functional things, right? So in our case, there's tasks being created. There is contact moments with customers getting logged in the system. And that's what we look at, right? How are our users interacting with the system? And that's what we care about on our dashboards most. Of course, the underlying technicals, they also matter. We have generic dashboards for those, and we monitor that. But those are typically not the things. If everything is somewhat healthy, that's not what's affecting your customer experience. So we tend to look at the actual functionalities that we're exposing to the users. We do have a bit of a section on our dashboard where we could capture those kind of metrics, like, okay, how many broken pipes happened, or other type of things that we care about, but might not be. Typically, we put them below the fold, right? Above the fold, you want to see things that are pertinent to the main flows of your users, the core functionality of your system. And then the details I try to put below the fold, so that when I'm interested and when I want to look at those, I scroll down a bit, I can look at those as well.
Okay, so it's not a prominent part. And I think one of the important things is backwards observability. So we might not necessarily look at that actively, but if we have question, we can look back on the history and see, okay, what was the average of this pipe broken?
That's the thing with observability, right? You can't know upfront what questions you want to ask. You can't measure everything because that's going to cost you a lot, and you need to instrument everything and you need to store all that data. But then it is a balance to strike. Like, how much do you measure? What things do you care about? How do you clean up, right? If you figure out after a while, like, okay, I'm measuring this, but it's not adding any value, it's unlikely we ever need this. Maybe you can stop measuring it.
That's a very good question. I think we will come back to that maybe at some point. Not today.
Sure.
What about the toxiproxy? Was it the first time you used it, or?
Yeah, it was the first time.
You liked it?
Yeah, I liked it. I fought a little bit with the setup. Documentation that I found seemed a little bit outdated. Like, the commands were slightly different from what the CLI was expecting. And initially I overcomplicated by I installed the CLI, and that comes with a server component and a client component to configure the server. But I didn't understand that I also got the server by installing the CLI. So I was messing around with Docker container and trying to configure it inside the Docker container. And that, of course, adds a bit of networking that you need to deal with to wire everything together properly. And then after a while, I figured, I can just do toxiproxy server and I have it running locally, and it's just as easy. But yeah, it was quick and easy. Nice enough.
And I looked a little bit on the documentation and the examples. It looks like it's very, very simple and focused tool, right? You cannot even have any complicated setup, at least out of the box. Like, I want to reply slowly for this request, but not for this. It will all be based only on the proxy that you configured.
Yeah.
I want to ask, what would be your advice with the toxiproxy? Try it and use it all the time, or just remember that it is here? And the second thing I want to ask, what are the lessons learned from this experience?
Like you said, toxiproxy is a very focused tool, right? So you need to have a certain class of problem for it to be useful. This particular case, I also I wouldn't automate this for every regression run that I want to do, right? I wouldn't put this in my unit tests where I'm spinning up toxiproxy to see how my service behaves. That might be very different if networking is a really important, like if the guaranteed delivery of messages, for example, is very important to your service. Maybe that could be different. I could imagine that, but I've never run into such a case myself. And for our use case, it's definitely not something you want to continuously use.
So it's something more like a throwaway situation. You grab the tool, you reproduce even locally, maybe with a throwaway unit test. In your case, just CU, exactly. You are happy with this. You're not keeping it in your continuous integration forever because that's not the main thing, and that's not what we're breaking. very
Exactly. For me, this was really about, there was a hypothesis that the case was broken pipe happens when the user navigates away, when the connection gets cut. And I wanted to substantiate that with a bit of evidence because it's word of mouth. People think, maybe it's this, right? It's not really hard enough evidence to go on and say, okay, I'm just going to implement something, hope that it works. Let's reproduce it. Let's make sure that's really what's going wrong. And then we can cover it with a simple unit test. Lessons learned. I'm very happy with the end result. Like doing this change, deploying it, and step by step chipping away at all of these false alerts. Right? So you really help your team get to a better place. It really makes the life of the operator much easier. Right? If you have to wade through a lot of noise, if you have to, for everything that comes in throughout the day where you're answering user questions, maybe you're spending a bit more time on doing reviews for the rest of the team. You're trying to do improvements from the backlog that go with the operator. And you're also looking at all of these alerts. It's nice if you can get less alerts so that you have more mind space for everything else that's already going on. It's already a lot of context switching and a busy job. So I felt we made it better for the operator by taking out one of the wrong alerts.
So we can say this, that even though it was not trivial and straightforward, it was well worth because it decreased the load and the distractions for the person who is watching for hours.
Yeah, and that's something you have to invest in, right? Over time, things tend to add up. You tolerate it for a bit, but if you tolerate it for too long in too many different places, you end up in where we were when I started in this team, that you have alerts constantly firing, but there's nothing wrong. And without looking at them, you can never be really sure.
Yeah, and then you start to pile up them and think, okay, we'll look later. Maybe we'll look tomorrow because the last 2 weeks I looked, nothing was happening really.
Exactly. So alert fatigue kicks in and your users suffer for it. You don't want to end up in that place.
I also saw that you mentioned that this whole broken pipe error will be removed, I think, in the future sprints.
I did some digging and I saw that there is an open ticket on GitHub for the Spring project. Where they wanted to improve the handling for it. Something got merged, but I didn't look at the details if it is actually fixing what I think it fixes. But it might mean that the change that I did is not going to be necessary anymore with a future version of Spring, which is nice, right? It's less code for us to maintain, so that's perfect.
Yes, but it's the future, and we don't know when. The thing with the buffers was also interesting because I don't think I really ever had the situation. It was always somewhere in the back of my mind that the buffer can influence this. And in this particular case, yes, it's much more low-level infrastructural. Probably people who are working with infra are very familiar with this, but for us, enterprise developers, it was slightly unexpected that you're getting completely different behavior. Well, not completely, still error on but very much different error reporting on the server side, depending on whether you're sending a little bit of response, a little bit more. The last question. What are the next great blog posts or discoveries are waiting for us? Do you have anything in the pipeline?
So I got accepted for Test Automation Days 2024, where I'll be talking about observability 101 for test engineers. I'm a test engineer myself, and I often see test engineers kind of neglecting observability. And I think it's a really powerful tool to have in your toolbox that can really help you do better testing, but also to help your team take more control of their service and learn from how your users are interacting with your application in production. Feed that back into the development lifecycle to improve the product or to improve the way you're building your product. And I intend to write something about the test data generator framework we've built here at TipTQ. And how we're using that for end-to-end testing, system testing, but also for test data service that with a front end that any user can use.
I like the service, yes. Observability, also good. Good, then maybe that's not the last chat of us on this channel.
That would be nice. I would love to be back.
Good, if you behave, we will bring you back.
I'll do my best.
Okay, have a nice
Thanks. See you later.
evening or whatever. Yeah, bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Okay.